Welcome to the first of what is going to be a series of Daily Tea deep dives. We're going to look beyond the headlines and find out the why behind some of the stories we cover on the Telegraph. And one of the biggest stories in journalism over the course of recent decades has been the contaminated blood scandal, Kamal. It's described as one of the biggest scandals in NHS history. It is one of those stories that first came to the surface years and years ago, and we keep on following the trail of devastation that's been left in the wake of what is described as tainted blood, contaminated blood, the blood scandal, because there's a very big event happening with this on Monday.
That's right. Sir Brian Langstaff, who's been leading the official inquiry into what went wrong, is publishing his report on Monday, which will reveal much more detail about who made mistakes, the terrible suffering that the tainted blood scandal caused for so many thousands of people and families, the people who died because of this scandal that happened.
We'll delve more into the detail of exactly what happened in just a moment. But in summary, for those unfamiliar with this was men, women and children who were treated by the NHS in the UK, and they were given blood and blood products that were infected with HIV, hepatitis and other diseases. Many of them, as you say, Kamal, later died. And it's one of those stories which has had such a huge impact on the public because it wasn't just the fact that there was a scandal, it was the fact that there were attempts to cover it up. And what this inquiry is going to pick into is going to determine the extent to which those victims and indeed their families were let down. Was this a sort of state-sponsored failure?
And we're very lucky to have on our journey today in this podcast, Cara McGoogan, who not only is one of the Telegraph's finest investigative journalists, but actually is the host of the Bed of Lies podcast, one of the finest pieces of journalism around this whole issue. Welcome, Cara. It's brilliant to have you with us. And I see that next to you is the latest edition of your book. Do you want to hold it up and let's have a look at it? Just tell us what that's about, the poison line.
Yeah, the poison line, life and death in the infected blood scandal. And this came out of my reporting for Bed of Lies. I then developed it into a book, kind of went further and deeper, got to follow more characters and learn more about what happened internationally in the infected blood scandal. And it came out this week in paperback, just ahead of the inquiry's report on Monday.
So that's great timing, and a link to where you can buy that book will be in the show notes, so do go and have a look at that.
Before we move on, Cara's being quite modest because this book was nominated for a very prestigious prize because you basically uncovered documents, didn't you, which revealed the American side of this scandal. Explain that to us, Cara.
So the inquiry in the UK is very much UK focused, and we're looking at what the government did wrong, what doctors did wrong, but it was American pharmaceutical companies that made this product. And I managed to track down lawyers and investigators in America who uncovered exactly what those companies had done, took them to court, and over a decade managed to get a verdict against them and proper compensation. They digitized all these documents from the 90s for me, put them on this database, and I've combed through hundreds, thousands of pages in order to write the America section of the book. And those documents are now actually part of the infected blood inquiry as well. The lawyers have, after working with me, started helping out with the inquiry.
Shall we go back to the very beginning of this scandal just so people listening to this and watching this on YouTube can understand where it started? And it started with a product called Factor 8. Explain to us, Cara, what is it and who was it given to?
So Factor 8 is a treatment for people with haemophilia, severe haemophilia A commonly. And people with haemophilia lack a protein in their blood that's needed to clot, which is also called Factor 8. And in the late 60s, early 70s, this revolutionary treatment was made. And it's a concentrated form of the protein that people with haemophilia lack. So it's taken from human plasma. So collecting tens of thousands of donations of plasma, concentrating it down to just that Factor 8 protein, you get this white powder. That's then mixed with sterile distilled water, and patients could inject it on the go at home, and it freed them from a life of lying up on a hospital bed whenever they had a bleed, which is where you knock your arm and your blood would continue to pool, and they'd get these painful internal bleeds which could be debilitating. And so factor VIII was this wonder drug that changed lives for people with haemophilia, but it was made from human plasma.
So the story started actually as something that seemed incredibly positive for haemophilia sufferers.
Yeah, it really freed people with haemophilia from the shackles of the hospital bed. Their earlier treatment, cryoprecipitate, had to thaw over hours. It was frozen, and then it was slowly transfused. And then it wasn't just factor VIII. There were other proteins and impurities in there. So, there was less concentrated. It took a while to really take effect. So this, pack it in a suitcase, take it on holiday, put it in the fridge, and off you went. So people started going kayaking, mountain climbing. It really did kind of change their lives.
And where did it start going wrong from this amazing breakthrough moment? What then happened?
So we weren't producing enough of our own factor VIII in the UK. What we were doing was making up the shortfall by importing factor VIII made in America. Now in the UK, it's illegal to pay people for their plasma. America had different rules. You could pay people for plasma and they could donate twice a week, whereas we can donate twice a month. And so that meant America was pumping out plasma. And so they were really feeding the world's needs. But what the payment meant was that the people donating tended to be on the lower end of society, impoverished people. You had intravenous drug users, sex workers, people that were at a higher risk of bloodborne viruses. And what we'll later come on to is that pharma companies were taking extraordinary risks with how they collected that plasma and then pooled it together to make factor VIII.
Cara, before we ask you when you sort of woke up to this story and realised there was something extraordinarily damaging to the patients that were affected going on, what was the situation dates-wise with the first cases of factor VIII proving to be more harmful than the cure emerging, and people coming forward and saying that they had been suffering from the terrible effects of it?
So right in the 1970s, when factor VIII is licensed, people start to contract hepatitis. People who were school children at the time talk about their skin going yellow. They'd call each other the golden boys, or, oh, he's gone yellow again, because they're going jaundiced with hepatitis. So there are signs of these viruses in factor VIII right at the beginning, but it's seen as a worthwhile risk of the treatment. Hepatitis isn't seen as that big of an issue compared with treating haemophilia. Then as the 80s come around and AIDS starts to become a crisis in America, in July 1982, 3 people with haemophilia come down with AIDS. And at that point, the discussion starts racing. How did they get it? Could it be in factor VIII? In the UK, it's not for another couple of years until we fully accept that factor VIII can transmit AIDS, what is then known as HTLV3, the virus HIV. And we were incredibly sluggish in actually telling patients and stopping using factor VIII.
Kamal and I were at an event recently with Ian Hislop, the editor, long-standing editor of the Private Eye magazine, and he recalled that he thought that they wrote their first story about contaminated blood in 1986. So it was being reported on back then, but the response to the scandal was what, Cara?
Yeah, so 1985 would have been when most people received AIDS diagnosis, and back then they were told you have 2 years to live. It was also an incredibly stigmatised disease, so a lot of people were told not to tell anyone, not to tell their own family members, keep it secret. So they're dealing with this death sentence and also this kind of like, you've now have to keep this secret. I recently spoke to someone last week who actually started teaching her very young children to lie because she knew her young son had AIDS, and at some point, well, it was AIDS then, but she knew her young son had HIV, and at some point when she told him his diagnosis, he was going to have to be able to lie to everyone. So she taught him to little lies. So from 86, that's when people receive their infections. And what we then see is the UK government tries to say for many years, we did all we could, this was a freak incident, we couldn't have known about this new illness, we couldn't have stopped it, nothing could have been done differently, it was just a big disaster. Accidental disaster.
Just take us through the blood-borne illnesses. So just explain what hepatitis is and why then there was a link when HIV and AIDS became a thing.
So hepatitis is a virus that attacks the liver. It means inflammation of the liver, and there are different types of hepatitis. You have A, B, then you have D and E, and these versions of hepatitis were seen as not too damaging. It's quite a short-lived illness. You might be very sick, but you'll get over it. In the 70s, this new strain emerges that they were calling non-A, non-B, which we now know as hepatitis C. And that is much more virulent. Over a long period of time, often decades, it slowly attacks your liver and you become more and more sick. And the symptoms are strange. They can be brain fog, fatigue, stomach cramps. If you don't have the diagnosis, you might not know what it is that's kind of just bringing you down. And ultimately that can lead to cirrhosis and liver cancer. So at the time, this new hepatitis wasn't seen as that dangerous, but it started to become clear that it was a longer running condition. And then HIV, it had similar traits early on epidemiologically, if I've got that right, where you were seeing people that had contracted hepatitis then developing AIDS before we knew about HTLV3. And so it's similar patterns of people getting these illnesses. So you could, in those early days, they started talking about hepatitis B being a marker. Like if you've tested positive for hepatitis B, we should start ruling those people out of donating because they're highly likely to then be in the category of people that might get HIV.
Why was it not until 2019 that the inquiry was opened?
Well, this is the cover-up that you mentioned, Camilla. There were decades of attempts to kind of brush this under the carpet. So we had 2 inquiries previously. The Archer inquiry, which was set up by a Lord Archer, and it didn't have statutory powers. It was damning, but it couldn't interview ministers, and the government essentially ignored it. We then had the Penrose inquiry in Scotland. It couldn't compel ministers from Westminster to go up to Scotland and give evidence. And it was widely deemed as a whitewash. Yeah. It said nothing could have been done differently. And the one thing they said was that people who had a blood transfusion before 1991 should be tested for hepatitis C because they might be living with it but not know. That has never been done. So Theresa May comes in 2017 and announces the infected blood inquiry after a huge swell of sort of campaigning and legal agitation. And it gets to a point where she just can't not announce this inquiry. And so after a bit of kind of slow-moving bureaucracy, it opened in April 2019.
How would you describe the response going back to when there was some evidence of the very bad effects on people? Were there deaths at that stage? And then what was the response of government, health authorities, the pharmaceutical companies?
So for my book, one shocking example that I dug into was the case of Professor Arthur Bloom, who was our leading haemophilia doctor and advisor to the government. And there are these crucial months in 1983, when more evidence is coming out that blood products could transmit AIDS, and there's a sluggish response from doctors and the government. Professor Arthur Bloom has one of the first AIDS cases in people with haemophilia in his hospital. And he is in the hospital writing in medical notes that this person has suspected AIDS. He's then going and speaking to government ministers and conferences and saying, we have no cases of AIDS, there's nothing to worry about here, we should just keep using factor VIII. There would be a run on treatment if we stopped using it, better to stay the course. And so that, as I outline in the book, the sort of day by day, how he's kind of assessing this patient, then going out and kind of downplaying it is shocking. But that's across the board. We see the pharmaceutical companies doing that. We see government ministers doing that. Warnings go ignored and unheeded. And at every step of the way, when they could have done something to protect people, they didn't.
And what does Dr. Bloom say about this? Is he still alive? Is he still...
Well, this is the problem of having an inquiry 40 years on. He passed away in the 90s. He actually passed away a couple of weeks after a French doctor was imprisoned for his role in the scandal. And so there's some question of whether, he was emotionally wrought by what had happened. And a fellow doctor had gone to prison in France and he had a brain hemorrhage. So was that stress related? We'll never know.
Cara, when you're delving into a story like this, which has already had a lot of coverage, you obviously decided that we should do a podcast series on it. That's how Bed of Lies, your very popular and indeed award-winning series for the Telegraph, came about. You have to get a fresh angle on the story, and you managed to find this group of schoolboys, a large group of schoolboys, who had all been affected by this. Tell us about that.
So there's one school in the UK that is a bit of a focus point for this story. It's called the Lord Mayor Trelaw College, and 122 boys with haemophilia went there. It was a boarding school for children with physical disabilities, and they had an on-site haemophilia centre. So it was a great place for children with the condition. They could meet boys just like themselves. But they were also a captive audience for doctors who were researching new ways to use factor VIII, who were receiving grant money from pharmaceutical companies. Boys told me, that they had backpacks branded with pharmaceutical logos, watches, pens. When you hear what happened to them later, that all becomes a bit shady. But these boys, there were 122, 80 have since died because of infections with HIV and hepatitis C. So just around 40 or so survived to see the inquiry.
Do you think the doctors were acting out of the best of intentions? Obviously, you're saying that the pharmaceutical firms were very closely involved, which, as you say, immediately should raise suspicions. But the doctors themselves, were they acting because they thought this is going to really help this set of children?
I've spoken to quite a few doctors as part of my research, and what I don't want to do is kind of vilify doctors, because I don't think this is a sort of case of evil doctors. And for me, they're at the sort of bottom end of the chain. But they did make decisions that put patients' lives in danger. There was a patrician culture back then. So what the doctor said went. So patients weren't told of the risks of treatment. They weren't given an opportunity to switch to an older treatment, the safer version, which was made from one donor of plasma. And so they took risks. I think there's also an argument that they were blinded to the dangers of factor VIII because they thought it was such a revolutionary product. And for doctors like Arenstam, who was the Trelaw's doctor, I think they were interested in their own medical research as well, sort of furthering science. And the only way to do that is to use the product and monitor patients.
What do you mean when you say single donor was safer?
So factor VIII was made from tens of thousands of pooled donations. So you give your plasma, Camilla gives her plasma, along with thousands of other people, and it's put into one vat, mixed together and concentrated down to make factor VIII. And just one donor has to have an infection for the whole batch to be contaminated. The older treatment, cryoprecipitate, was made with one, maybe two or three donations. It was distilling down the plasma of one person, freezing it, and then giving the treatment. So it was more rudimentary, it was clunkier, and it took longer, but you had a much lower risk of bloodborne viruses.
And the other piece in this puzzle, Cara, is that we talked about the American pharmaceutical companies earlier, but even as this scandal is unfolding, they seem to be taking ever bigger risks with the factor VIII that they're putting together to send over to the UK?
Yeah, so this factor VIII is being prescribed to children, to vulnerable people, people with haemophilia in America and around the world, people like Joe, Frankie's husband. And the pharmaceutical companies were collecting plasma for it in prisons. They were taking mobile trucks into nightclub districts in the centre of American cities as the AIDS crisis was emerging. They bought plasma from STD clinics. And I discovered adverts used in American lawsuits where they were advertising for gay men to donate plasma who had tested positive for hepatitis B, because they would use a portion of that plasma to make an immunoglobulin treatment for hepatitis B. And the remaining plasma would then go into factor VIII. And as I mentioned earlier, those gay men who'd had hepatitis B were the most at risk of contracting AIDS. But the prisons, for me, is really the kind of make you stop moment. And I spoke to lawyer Tom Mull, who uncovered that Louisiana State Penitentiary, this wild American prison that has a sprawling grounds the size of Manhattan, the prisoners are forced to work in the fields. There's a kind of, it's got its own unique culture. There's a rodeo each year and thousands of people come in to spectate. It's a crazy place. But it was also a hive of illness. People were shooting intravenous drugs, they were having sex with one another, and they were kind of fashioning these rudimentary tattoos using a biro and a bit of equipment and, injecting one to another. And I actually recently, when I was in America a couple of years ago with the Washington Post, I met some people who had been in the prison in the 80s, and I spoke to 3 or 4 of them, and they all had hepatitis.
We should pay tribute, Cara, to the people who did raise the red flag. I know in the Poison Line you focused on the role of whistleblowers and how they were shut down.
Yeah, so you have whistleblowers from doctors to people in the pharmaceutical companies who tried to raise the alarm, and often they found themselves pushed out. So one person that I found particularly interesting is the inventor of Factor VIII, Dr. Edward Shambrom. After making this treatment, he started to say, I think this is going to cause the spread of viruses and it's going to be dangerous. We need to find a way to heat it up or treat it with chemicals to pasteurize it and kill viruses. But instead of listening to him, the company that had kind of like championed him licensed this first product and was about to go on to make millions, billions of dollars, demoted him and ultimately pushed him out. And so he was then on the outside. He came up with a way to chemically clean Factor VIII in the early 80s, and he took it to every pharma company and they said, no, we don't want it. And this is happening in the background. A question of, could we have made Factor VIII safer? The answer is yes. After AIDS emerges and a German company introduces a heat-treated version that is safe from viruses, the other 4 companies in America, Baxter, Bayer, Armour and Alpha, they start researching heat-treating Factor VIII. And by February 1984, they all have a safer version of the treatment available. So it's taken them just a couple of years in the end. But once again, in the UK, we were slow to adopt that. And into 1985, we were still injecting patients with the dangerous unheated version.
Have any of the pharmaceutical companies paid for any of this or been successfully sued, or has anyone been held to account?
Yeah, well, this, Kamal, is something that I'm keen to talk about as the inquiry happens, because the inquiry is not looking at the pharma companies in that much detail. That's not its remit. But in America, there were lawsuits that ended up with compensation from the pharma companies. In Germany, the government forced the pharma companies to contribute half the money for their compensation pot. And that also happened in Japan. And so, I mean, it might be highly unlikely, but I want our government to ask the question, should we try and recoup some of this money? Because those companies are the people that made the product.
When it comes to the findings of the public inquiry, what are the victims and the families of those who died during the scandal hoping to hear?
So they're hoping that at long last the report will lay out why they came to be infected and who was involved. And this is going to be a complicated, mess of responsibility. I call the book The Poison Line because for me that captures the full chain of culpability, from the doctors at the very end of the line who injected patients and then all the way back to the politicians that imported it and allowed it to keep being used, to the pharma companies who were making Factor VIII, collecting that dangerous plasma and pooling tens of thousands of donations together. So I think we'll see an array of criticisms. The chair of the inquiry, Sir Brian Langstaff, last year said there were systemic wrongs at every level. So I think he will be damning. In that report last year, he recommended the government pay compensation now without delay. We haven't seen that happen. The government has insisted for the last year, against his recommendations, that it would wait for this final report to announce its compensation plans. So victims, bereaved family members are hoping that that announcement will finally come this week. And on top of that, they want a heartfelt, meaningful apology. You know, whether that's Rishi Sunak standing in Parliament and apologising for wrongs that were done. I think a lot of people are hoping that will happen.
Cara, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your wisdom and expertise on this story.
Thank you so much, Kamal and Camilla. And I just want to thank Sarah Peters, my producer, for Bed of Lies, and also let you know that we have a third series of the podcast coming very soon.
Looking forward to that. Thank you very much.